Kristen, you know what grinds my gears?
Cars?
Yes, definitely cars, but also rich people taking 15-minute flights in their private jets to avoid traffic. It makes a person wonder, is tax justice also climate justice? Or, more broadly, what role does the tax justice system have in our fight against climate change?
And welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with my co-host, Kyla Hewson.
On today's episode, we spoke with Franziska Mager, Senior Researcher and Advocacy Lead for Climate and Inequalities at the Tax Justice Network. She leads the Tax Justice Network's work on integrating tax and climate justice approaches in service of reducing inequalities.
In this conversation, Franziska explains why taxes are important for climate justice and for reprogramming our economies off of their dependence on fossil fuels. She also discusses some of the concrete tax measures that countries could introduce to solve the climate financing gap, while also promoting social and economic justice and correcting for climate injustices, both within and between countries. So let's do it. Franziska, thanks so much for talking to me today. To get us started, why is tax important for addressing the climate crisis and for doing so in an inclusive way?
Sure. So tax and climate interact in lots of ways. But a couple of things that might spring to your mind is that, for once, of course, governments can design energy tax systems that encourage industry to favor clean over dirty energy sources. So they can use tax to incentivize away from fossil fuels. Taxes can also make the use of polluting goods and services more expensive. So think, for example, of the Yellow Vest protests in France, where the government had this pretty badly designed plan to raise the price of gasoline, and this completely enraged people dependent on their cars. And the list goes on and on and on, right? So taxes are really everywhere when it comes to the climate. And that's because tax is this kind of glue in the social contract rather than just something technical to collect money. Because taxes make government's decisions real for people, and it shows them who and what it pays attention to. So in all things climate and beyond, it's really interesting looking at where taxes are levied and what ideas and priorities those sorts of decisions represent.
Fantastic. So yeah, tax is it's super important for lots of parts of society. And you're an expert on tax justice. So can you maybe just, for somebody who's never heard of tax justice before, what is it and what does it aim to achieve?
Tax justice is this idea that has come about in, I'd say, last 20 plus years. And it means nothing other than realizing well-funded states that deliver for everyone. And there are 5 R's we use to think about this. The first R is the revenue side of tax, and that's the one that most people would have thought about the most, probably. It's the most well-known benefit derived from taxation. So states need to raise money, and tax is one of the main ways to do this, and that's why, you and I pay income tax. The second benefit to taxation is that you can use it as a way to reprice. So think about how cheap cigarettes were when you were a kid and how expensive they've become. And that's because governments realize that something that's quite cheap shouldn't be as cheap. It's a negative externality, and it should be made more expensive. Within the economic system that we live in, tax can also help with redistribution. That's a third R. So that's the idea of reducing inequalities between different groups in terms of wealth or income, for example, by shifting resources around between groups. But also horizontal inequalities like gender inequality can be tackled through tax policies. The fourth benefit, or R, that we use is about representation. So the idea that taxation and fair taxation specifically can help improve the social contract between voters and government and increases the level of trust between both parties. The fifth R is a more recent addition, and that's all about reparations. So the idea that you can use tax and tax systems to redress some of the historical and colonial legacies in place at the moment. So those are the key concepts we work with in this field when we think about tax justice.
Fantastic. And I think there are things coming to mind for the relationship between those 5 Rs, all 5 of them, and like this massive societal project we have on climate change. So we're going to dig into those. Before we get into those 5 Rs and how they relate to climate change, your work has emphasized the complementarities between tax justice and climate justice. So why are the two related?
That's a great question. And the most obvious reason is that both are progressive movements that are trying to tackle and to redress a very deeply discriminatory balance of power and practices and legacies that are being held up by a minority at the expense of everyone else in society. So think about it in this way. On the one hand, most people everywhere, you and me and everyone else, are forced to pay taxes, and we have very little to no leeway over how and whether we do this or not. But the richer you get, the more aggressive tax planning you can do, the more expensive your lawyers get and your accountants and so on. And the bigger your power to hide away your money becomes. And therefore also the bigger the sums that are being lost become. And that's true of both individuals and corporations. So we just estimated that about $311 billion a year are lost to cross-border corporate tax abuse by multinationals, and offshore tax abuse by wealthy individuals means at least 169 billion lost per year. And the thing is that these costs are then being borne by the rest of us. That's money that's lost, and it should be there, that governments should be able to spend on citizens. And in this process, I think that's really important. Governments also lose legitimacy in the long term because people aren't stupid. And we know that what rich people and corporations are able to pull off in terms of tax evasion, you and I are not able to do, and we don't have the same privilege. And now, on the other hand, if you think about climate justice, I think climate activists also face a really big task in getting us all to kind of wake up to the unfairness and rethink this idea of responsibility for the climate crisis and those most affected by it, the minority at the expense of the majority. And this feeling is very familiar to what we're up against in the tax justice movement. We know, for example, that cumulative emissions, so those measured over time, not just right now, paint a very clear picture, and that since 1990, the bottom 50% of the world has only been responsible for about 16% of all emissions. But the total emissions coming from the top 1% of people exceed 50% of all emissions. And if you break this down by corporations, for example, and the inequality between multinationals and smaller companies, you can see a similar picture of inequality, of few multinationals really dominating the emissions that have been produced and are being produced at the moment, and also between jurisdiction, between petrostates and other countries, for example. So in both spaces, tax and climate, it means that those communities that are least responsible for the damage being done, be it money lost or emissions, are suffering the worst of the consequences. So that's what we're trying to solve by bringing the two together.
Yeah, I really liked how you articulated that, because it seems that there's been sort of a shift in how like climate conversations have gone, where like before we talked a lot about like collective action problems, and now there's been a lot of people pointing to this sort of problem of justice and redistribution. And I think talking about tax justice and climate justice in the same vein really sort of brings out how that's true. And I know we're going to get into this more later on, but tax justice is also like a solution to climate change, is it not?
I think so. I think it is. And I think it offers very concrete and very targeted proposals, ideas, both in terms of processes and regulations, but then also in terms of specific tax proposals that we could use to tackle some of the worst effects of the climate crisis.
Definitely. And we'll get into some of those ways right now, actually. So just to start with, let's talk about carbon taxes, always a big topic, very politically divided. What is carbon tax justice, and why is it something that's important to think about?
Right. So we essentially coined this term to embed this very strong justice lens into how we within our organization and in the climate space talk about and think about taxes in the context of the climate crisis, because tax goes so much further than being just this technical, kind of slightly unloved, very convoluted, very complicated vehicle or way to raise money. Everything about tax is inherently political. So everything about tax is also about justice. On top of that, carbon tax justice refers to actual carbon taxes, like you just mentioned. And that's one of those areas that seems exactly that, very complicated, very technical, very neutral at the surface in terms of a policy area, efficiency driven at the surface, but also reveals some of the really deeply held power dynamics in the climate space, with the likes of the OECD or the IMF leading really the push for carbon taxes as the standout climate policies that all countries should follow. That's the best thing to do. But the OECD is what we call a rich country club with its own specific set of incentives that we'll dig into a little bit later. So in essence, we see carbon tax justice as this very holistic way to think about taxation in the context of the climate crisis, but also the crisis of inequality. And the idea that we need a really deep structural financial and tax reform that's fit for the 21st century, and the realities that we all face that respond to both of these crises and the often historical injustices and inequalities between different groups that they represent.
Carbon taxes are often talked about in the context of repricing for climate change. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what repricing is in the context of climate change and really how carbon taxes or other taxes can help with that.
Sure. So maybe to clarify first, repricing is a whole category of policies that governments can use to make polluting emissions or other harmful things. We had the cigarettes example, alcohol, etc., more expensive. So something that's being recognized as too cheap for the harm that it inflicts collectively. And the goal here in relation to emissions is to raise how much a metric ton of carbon costs over time and to make it much more expensive. And that's usually done through either carbon taxes or emissions trading systems, or sometimes a combination of the two. And from our perspective, as a justice-led organization, I think there are two things to say, and it's tricky to make it clear that they're both true at the same time. And the first one is that carbon taxes, or just a high price on carbon generally, is a really important building block for a green transition, because it should be expensive to pollute. It shouldn't be as cheap. So carbon emissions need to become financially unattractive and quite quickly, especially in high income countries that are already far exceeding their carbon budgets. Now, on the side of the design and how you design and implement a policy like that, I think that's where the issues come up. The other side of the coin is that there is a really strong sense of unfairness and almost laziness to how policymakers and politicians think about the carbon price. And the Yellow Vests protest is a really good example. They show the really high regressive potential of carbon taxes and other indirect taxes like VAT or sales tax, for example, in terms of hitting poor groups worse because they take a bigger chunk out of their disposable income. But, governments, organizations love carbon taxation and carbon pricing because it's a tool to correct an inefficiency in the market that shouldn't be there. So the problem here is that these efficiency arguments approach carbon pricing as if this happens in a political vacuum, when really there is no guarantee for fairness. Even if you put the idea of redistribution into your draft law, for example, so the idea of cashbacks or dividends or things like that, there is no guarantee that some other ministry or some other department will make sure that people do have decent living standards, that human well-being becomes part of the calculation. Right now, this political vacuum and this pretend political vacuum, I think, is the biggest problem. So the effects on poor groups especially are, in all of these proposals, if at all, an afterthought, a kind of a footnote that's often relegated to a separate group of decision makers. And we can't guarantee that we can protect those groups and actually make them flourish.
I'm just wondering for somebody who may not know very much about carbon taxes or how they work, you had mentioned that carbon taxes can be regressive, can hurt sort of the people that are least able to pay. Can you just maybe explain how that works? And also what are some ways that governments could try to solve that problem, or maybe are already?
The idea is that you make the whole consumption and production process involving greenhouse gas emissions and carbon in particular more expensive. Usually, what governments do when they design carbon taxes is that they announce a higher price on a sort of escalating ladder. So, say, in 2 years, we're saying the metric ton of carbon will cost this much. And then in 2027, it will go up again. 2030, it will become even more expensive, and so on. So that industry, but also the consumption side, consumers, society can kind of organize around it, find ways to divest away from these production or consumption processes into more sustainable alternatives. And that's why it's usually done fairly slowly and announced ahead of time. Some ways to counteract the potential regressive effects on poor groups are things like dividends, citizens' dividends, so-called. So you can, for example, pool the additional revenue from these carbon taxes and pay out citizens, either all citizens or citizens below a certain income, a cash sum per month or per year. And there's different ideas floating around there how you can do that. So in theory, it's entirely possible, and some countries or provinces in some cases manage to do that. I think the problem there is that we can't guarantee, because of how politics work, because of austerity, because of what other government ministries and departments do in practice, that people's living standards don't change and don't drop. Because, public spending is constantly being undercut, social services are constantly being undercut in all of these other ways, including through other tax policy changes.
All right, so that's repricing. Let's go into sort of another R, revenue. What is the climate finance funding gap, and why is it important?
Yeah, most people will have heard by now that there's a big climate finance gap. And this refers to a couple of different things. Firstly, the money for loss and damage that's needed. And this is probably the most important area. So that's what's needed for countries and for people to recover after extreme weather events. It's hard to calculate, but by some estimates, low and middle income countries could face up to a 580 billion annually by 2030 for loss and damage alone. And these sums are just so unimaginable, so hard to wrap your head around. It feels very overwhelming, especially since many of the same countries and communities most affected by these extreme weather events are in the global south, and they already have their own additional challenges like servicing existing debt. Then secondly, the finance gap doesn't stop at loss and damage. Adaptation also needs to be financed. And by adaptation, we mean the adjustments needed to protect ourselves from the effects of the climate crisis. And we need to finance mitigation measures too. So to make the impacts of climate change less severe, essentially by quickly reducing emissions through different policies. So in practice, all of this means actually very deep structural transformations are necessary, and they're all incredibly expensive. Up until now, kind of unbelievably, there has not really been a globally coordinated source of funding for those communities that are hardest hit by climate disasters. And at the most recent UN Climate Change Conference last year, COP27, we saw for the first time an agreement to establish a new loss and damage fund, which would then pool together loss and damage money in one place. But how this will happen exactly and how fair the process is really remains to be seen. And the fact that this agreement in itself was considered a breakthrough, and that kind of tells you already how ridiculously late and slowly these steps are being taken in relation to climate finance.
Yeah, definitely. So there's just a huge amount of money that needs to be spent both within countries and globally to carry out this societal project, and also to deal with all the stuff that climate change ruins. Okay, so we've got this big hole that we need to fill with money. So what are some tax measures that we can use to address the climate finance funding gap?
Sure, there's a lot to talk about here, but let's focus on two things. And I think the temptation, and that's also completely justified, is to jump to specific tax proposals, that tell you you could raise X or Y amount with this or that tax. But first, we need to talk about processes and regulations specifically in relation to financial transparency. So any country, but especially those in the global south that are more intensely exposed to the effects of the climate crisis, need to be able to raise more revenue themselves, right? And abusive tax practices by multinational companies are one of the most significant contributors to governments not being able to collect the taxes that they should be paid, that they're entitled to. Huge sums are being lost to that. That's why one key funding solution is not just about implementing specific taxes, but it's about closing the gaps that allow for these abusive tax practices by multinationals in particular to continue and instead add more of that lost tax revenue to the tax base. And those are things that we work on that include automatic exchange of financial information between countries, beneficial ownership registers, country by country reporting for multinational companies, unitary taxation of income, and much more. Then secondly, taxes themselves. So there's lots of good stuff there. At the corporate level, for example, you could raise a lot of money from fossil fuel companies, for example, through things like windfall or excess profit taxes. And that's actually relatively low-hanging fruit, considering that it's relatively easy to implement and yields very high returns in terms of the money. At the individual level as well, a progressive tax on extreme wealth, on those people, for example, with assets over 100 million. You could do this in different ways, could generate up to 300 billion per year, according to the World Inequality Lab, to run with that example. And at the sectoral level as well, levies that you could apply to the aviation or shipping industry, for example. Shipping contributes about 3% of global emissions, could raise several hundred billions of dollars annually. So the sums that you could raise through these different taxes are also huge.
So really, I mean, that first pillar is all about stuff that we should be doing for tax justice anyway. And then there's also some sort of additional measures that, I mean, a wealth tax, I guess, is not specifically climate related, but as you were talking about before, sort of like addresses the inequality problem that links the two. Let's talk about that one. We know that climate change is making inequalities within and between countries worse. How can tax help to ensure a just response?
There are some really obvious tax solutions here, and we can talk about two. So the first one is a wealth tax, like the one you just mentioned. And maybe just to set the scene a little bit and to clarify, in relation to the climate crisis, wealth really, really matters, even more so than income, because as people get richer, their emissions increase by a lot. So we all emit carbon, we're all polluting. You and I are, especially in high income countries with all of these unsustainable consumption habits, we emit too much. But the world's richest people in terms of wealth emit these really just outsized and huge and completely unsustainable amounts of carbon. And unlike ordinary people, most of their emissions we now think come from their investments, which are a form of wealth, as opposed to their day-to-day consumption habits. So we would say that a progressive wealth tax on investments specifically can really penalize carbon-intensive portfolios or other investments that the wealthy have, especially if you think of those kinds of investments that lock in emissions for years to come. For example, because their holdings in a big infrastructure project, like a big energy or big transport project, the steel sector, the cement sector, and so on. This specific type of wealth tax could incentivize away from fossil fuel, while also reducing the extreme wealth inequality and also raising revenue. What's important to say in this context is that there is a really natural complementarity with our work on secrecy and beneficial ownership, because we need to know who owns what. And that's not actually currently the case. So our work on beneficial ownership transparency especially includes a focus on carbon-intensive portfolios, fossil fuel company ownership, in order to strip away the layers of financial secrecy and of anonymity, protecting those that actually own these assets from accountability and targeted policies. The second example is the corporate level, and that's an obvious one, and it's excess profit taxes. So besides petrostates that derive a lot of their income from fossil fuel extractions, fossil fuel corporations are responsible for a big share of global emissions. So governments need to tax fossil fuel companies more and also do so differently. In 2022, Global Witness said that the 5 biggest oil and gas giants paid out 102 billion in profits to benefit their investors. Specifically, they paid out 48 billion in dividends and spent 55 billion to repurchase their own shares to artificially inflate the shareholder value and stock price. So governments just have to get it together. They should create a tax of up to, say 90% on the excess profits of fossil fuel companies and other polluting corporations. And that doesn't mean 90% of all of their profits, but on profits above a certain level over a certain amount of time compared to previous years. So when things start to become really obscene. And very importantly, these taxes should be permanent to really push for a systemic structural transformation of economic incentives rather than just be in place, say, for a year or two. And we see some countries, especially in the EU, starting to introduce these kind of excess profit taxes in the last few years, though usually not permanently.
I wonder if we can talk about that sort of like newer R, reparations. So how can tax measures help to address climate injustices? For example, the ones that result from colonization and other legacies of ecological damage.
There is some important, slightly more obvious climate justice asked that play to the idea of reparations and colonial injustice, like debt restructuring or cancellation, which would free countries of the strain that they're under to pay off debt and also try to implement a sustainable transition. But now there's also a reparations agenda that's emerging that deals specifically with a legacy of taxation. And this agenda is kind of trying to connect the dots between the climate funding commitments that richer countries have made under the Paris Agreement to eliminating all of the tax loopholes that deprive lower income countries of a lot of the tax revenue that they're entitled to, because those loopholes uphold a system of discrimination that goes back a very, very long time. And here we would bring in some of the policies I mentioned earlier. Africa, for example, loses a huge amount of money in illicit financial flows. That's flows of money that are leaving those countries when they shouldn't. And a very obvious example here is the extractive sector. And just one component of the extractive sector, corporate tax avoidance from mining, costs the continent at least $730 million per year, probably a lot more. This example shows us that many of the policies we have been campaigning for actually already sit very naturally within a reparations agenda because it's all about power. Some targeted policies to help resolve this would be things like unitary taxation. This is a way of taxing multinational corporations based on where they do real work, so where they have their staff, operate their factories, sell goods and services, instead of where they formally declare their profits, so usually in tax havens. The automatic exchange of financial information between countries, or country-by-country reporting, which is a transparency measure that exposes multinational corporations shifting profits into tax havens and artificially minimizing their tax burden. And very importantly, we also need better representation of countries from the global south, especially in the bodies and treaties that set the rules on global taxation, which has traditionally been the OECD first and foremost. And that's the organization we call the Rich Countries Club. There's now really important momentum and window of opportunity to shift the tax setting rules away from the OECD towards the UN, where at least all countries could participate on a more equal footing in discussions and decisions.
Yeah, so that question of representation, I think, is really important. So let's talk about that. How can tax justice help to ensure a democratic and representative response to the climate crisis? You had mentioned UN. Is that the way to go?
The current international tax order has severely limited individual countries' abilities, particularly lower income countries, to have sovereignty over their taxing rights, including over things like a minimum corporate tax rate, which has been in the news quite a bit recently. And that's because for the past 6 or so years, global tax policy has been dominated very heavily by the OECD. But the OECD only represents a minority of rich countries. I think it's about 38, and has been pretty ineffective at curbing the significant tax abuses by both multinational companies and high net worth individuals we've been talking about. So if you look at what the organization has achieved over those 60 or so years, the picture is really quite dire. So we need to give the global south a more meaningful seat at the table, where at least everyone gets to have a vote and discussions can happen in a different way that are more inclusive than what's happening at the moment. But that also means that the effectiveness of most, if not all, of what we discussed so far depends on getting this better platform in place at the international level that finally addresses some of these unfairnesses in the tax governance system. The good news is that there's a really important window of opportunity open right now. And we call this the UN process, and it's why a lot of our attention is directed at the UN these days, where this process is finally underway. There's a draft UN tax convention proposed, and it's being discussed in New York this past week and over the next few months. And depending how these negotiations and this process goes, it will give us a better idea of how UN leadership could look like on global tax policy. We think the biggest priority for our work right now is probably helping to make this inclusive, multilateral forum happen that hasn't existed so far.
Okay, so yeah, opportunity to maybe change the way that the global tax system is governed, and that could have all sorts of rollover effects for all of the other things you've been talking about. Is that why it's sort of like priority one right now?
Exactly. I think the idea there is that it's the deepest structural transformation that is necessary that will then have ripple effects on all of the other areas we've talked about and many more. And it wouldn't take away from, for example, the UNFCCC, where a lot of the climate policies are being negotiated. It would be a complement to that. And it may function in a fairly similar way in terms of voting, for example. So they're not happening at the expense of each other, but rather in complementarity.
Hopefully something good comes out of that. Sounds exciting. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I think for a lot of people, tax can be kind of like a very niche area. And when a lot of people think about climate change and tax, they only hear carbon tax. And it was really a pleasure to sort of hear you explain just the things that are inherent to tax justice, not even focused on climate change, can inherently sort of help out with climate change and can also help to address the inequality problem at the heart of it. But also that there are specific climate-related tax measures that could really help with repricing and things like that. So I really appreciate you taking the time today.
I think that's completely true. And I think tax is very intentionally kept or dealt with or framed as something that's very complicated. It's very technical. It's something for the experts. So meaning not you or me. If anything, what people know most about is things like the income tax rate, right? Most of us have an idea of whether that's progressive where we live or not. But it goes so much deeper than that. So that's why we love to talk about wealth taxes as well. Because if you put all of the different taxes that people are paying together and you get to the effective tax rate, you can see that most tax systems are really programmed to benefit richer groups rather than poorer groups. It's not enough to look at individual taxes and what drawbacks and benefits they offer. It's about putting it all together and demystifying it and giving people reasons to care about why it affects their life, including in relation to climate outcomes.
Kristen, I love that we have so many friends who work for the Tax Justice Network or have worked for the Tax Justice Network. Not that Franziska was like our friend before. I feel like she's our friend now. I feel like this organization is one of the ones we interact with the most on this show. So shout out to the Tax Justice Network. We love your work.
Yeah, tax justice for climate justice. Hell yeah.
Yeah, we're here for it. Yes, yes, yes. So what do you think, Kristen? Was tax justice a climate solution?
I mean, yeah, I'm all about redistribution. There are other purposes for tax justice as well, but I think that taxation is one of the most important, but also one of the least talked about climate solutions out there. And so I was really glad that we were able to do an episode on this and that Franziska, she did such a wonderful job of explaining the issue and also sort of concretely outlining measures that would be good on this issue. Because I think for a lot of people, taxes can be complicated and hard to engage with. So I really appreciated hearing her voice and for how well she explained it.
Yeah, and I know that it is a thing that people have trouble engaging with, but I also think that more and more people are realizing, as we ride through this gilded age that we are presently living in, billionaires abound. And I think that there's way less of a glow around most of the billionaires that we kind of see than there used to be even 5 years ago. Taylor Swift, maybe notwithstanding, but everyone else.
It is really nice to not have to, you used to hear so often Elon Musk, but he's a genius. You don't ever hear that anymore. And I love it. I love it so much. It was so annoying.
Yes. Being a billionaire doesn't make you a genius. It makes you lucky.
Yeah. And also probably the kid of millionaires, or at least the top 10%.
And also probably an asshole. It's really hard to become a billionaire without absolutely destroying an economy or some ecology somewhere on the planet. People are suffering because you're rich. And it's not just because you've taken all that money out of the system that we could be spending on healthcare, education, public transit, green home retrofits. It's not just because you've robbed society of that money. It's because in order to get that, a bunch of people were working for you for below poverty line wages, doing illegal stuff in a lot of cases.
Yeah. But I did like that this episode, some of it was about wealth concentration, which of course is something that we need to focus on. But I think Franziska did a good job of explaining how specific measures can also help to realign incentives to change our economy. And you can have things like targeted levies that help to incentivize us to get off of fossil fuels, which, reminds me that very recently we got rid of the carbon price, which is technically not a tax, but it's kind of a tax. Maybe we should bring that back.
Yeah, what an interesting choice for our prime minister to have made. I think he wrote a whole book about how taxing for our values is how we should proceed as a society. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. He just became prime minister legitimately, he got elected in, and it'll be interesting to see where things go from here for Canada. It was a very exciting election, to say the least. And, well, not everyone, most people are always unhappy with the election results, regardless of what happens. But I'm excited to see kind of where things go from here. And at least Pierre Poilievre didn't win. So, Kristen, did you have any final thoughts on tax justice and where we need to go from here?
I think this was a really interesting episode. I think we need to put more attention to the fact that climate change is an issue of economic justice, and that things like tax policy are absolutely relevant to solving the climate crisis. So I'm just really happy we did this episode. That's my final thought.
You did a really great job, and so did Franziska. I loved editing this, and I'm sure our listeners enjoyed listening. Listeners, if you would like more progressive Canadian podcasts in your ears, you can check out the Harbinger Media Network at harbingermedianetwork.com, and we will catch you on the next episode. We are grateful to be learning and unlearning on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as well as the ancestral unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We encourage listeners to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the history of their own territory and to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.